Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just take my bonnet off first. That's probably a good move. My late father used to say that, you know, when you're as follically challenged as I am and as he was, it's quite hard to stop wearing a bonnet once you start wearing it, particularly in the winter. And I begin to notice that myself, you know. But anyway, on to more heady matters, if you pardon the pun. This is a great pleasure for me, not least because, A, I absolutely love this book, but also because Jen Stout and I are old pals in that sense, and we know each other pretty well. So if I go easy on her, that's perhaps why. But it's not difficult to go easy when it comes to chatting with Jen. The way I want to start this today, I mean, I'm going to read the blurb. I don't know how many people here. Maybe a show of hands. How many people have actually read the book so far? Right, good. So you know. Right, there we go. So some people have read it. So for the benefit of those who obviously haven't, I'll just go through the formal blurb at the moment. So Jen is obviously Jen Stout, a correspondent, writer, radio producer, originally from Fair Isle, and then moved to Shetland. She's a former BBC Scotland journalist. She left Russia at the outbreak of the invasion and moved to Romania and then to Ukraine, covering the war as a freelancer, about which we'll hear quite a bit later on, because I'm keen to touch on this whole issue of freelancing, as I know indeed Jen is. And she's written regularly for a number of publications, Sunday Post, London Review of Books, most recently The New Humanist, and Prospect, which I believe you've just been commissioned by them again, perhaps, for some stuff.
Yes, I have a big piece out with Prospect. It'll be in the print edition.
Her radio work also includes the BBC's From Our Own Correspondent and Any Questions. Now, I know that since the book was published to considerable acclaim, and I mean considerable acclaim, Jen has been north, south, east and west across the UK, obviously promoting the book, talking about the book and whatever. So I'm sure she could do this standing on her head right now. It's been a long and pretty arduous process, I gather.
And
so,
delightful also.
Delightful also. But that's the Jen Stout that the blurb tells you about. Let me tell you about the Jen Stout that I know. Jen Stout I know is someone who is incredibly sensitive and aware of the surroundings in which she operates, and that is reflected in the book. The Jen Stout I know is someone who likes a pint, likes a blether, you know, and cares an awful lot about the people she reports on, which, frankly, is something of a rare commodity in some respects in today's cut and thrust media world. And that, I think, is really what is reflected in the book. I say it's received considerable acclaim, and it most certainly has. I mean, people within our profession, at the very top end of the profession, almost unanimously have acclaimed this book, and rightly so. What I want to do is to go into a little bit about Jen's background and the kind of genesis of the book itself before we maybe move on to other issues like freelancing in the conflict environment and indeed some of the politics itself. We've got an hour, so I want to leave enough time for some Q&A from yourself. But I'd like to begin just by asking Jen, tell us a bit more about that background, because it's not everyone that goes from Fair Isle to Shetland to Donetsk.
Yeah, it's not. But I think there's a thing in Shetland because most people leave, and a lot of them come back. And because there used to be the merchant navy, and it was just kind of normal for people to go away and have adventures and go very far away all over the world and return. So it wasn't, you know, when I said I was going off to Russia, there was no people just go, oh right, yeah, grand. It wasn't a very big thing, and we'd gone. I mean, how it all started is a good teacher, which, you know, that can change your life. So when I was 15 or so, and I was at the Anderson High School, which is the big school in Lerwick, and I can't say I was either enthusiastic or regularly attending, to be honest. And then I just got this one really good teacher. She offered Russian at intermediate level, and it was like I'd spoken it in a past life. I already knew it, do you know? And I liked the grammar. I liked the sound of it and the feel of it in your mouth. I couldn't really explain it. And then I learnt all about the history and the politics and the culture, and started reading Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian journalist who was killed in 2006. And she was covering the war in Chechnya, and I was reading this and thinking, that's what I want to do. And it took me a very, very long time. So I went to university and studied Russian, but I had to change changed the degree because they charged at the time £1,500 to go on your year abroad, and I had about 50 maybe. So that wasn't going to happen. And then when I graduated, I had everything set up to go and teach English in Izhevsk, where Mr. Kalashnikov was still living, actually. And my mum got poorly, and so that was off. So it took a very long time to get where I wanted to be. And when I finally got on this fellowship, the Alpha Fellowship, it was November 2021. And frankly, it was too late for any of that.
I mean, that kind of love affair, that falling in love with things Russian, Central Eastern European, actually reminds me of another friend of this book festival who I believe has appeared here, Angus Roxburgh, who used to be the BBC's Moscow correspondent, and he tells in his own book actually a very similar story about, you know, almost falling in love with the language, listening to it on the radio and whatever. Absolutely, you know. So, I mean, going to Russia itself, I mean, what initial impressions when you get there? Did it live up to this love affair, to this kind of passion that you had for the place, or were you immediately sort of concerned about what you encountered? It's really hard
to look back on that now, because it feels like a whole different world. You know, like I don't really speak Russian much anymore. I'm learning Ukrainian. I can understand Ukrainian, and it all has such a tinge to it. It's such a darkness to it all that it's quite hard to remember how kind of naive and optimistic I was when I was younger. But yeah, I mean, I remember the thing that I really liked, and this is true of a lot of places in Eastern Europe, it's not just Russia, is that there was no British small talk, reading between the lines kind of stuff. People were extremely direct, and that suits me a lot because I'm shit at small talk and I hate it. And so once I stopped being offended all the time because people were being very direct, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders, and I could... You know, there was and that kind of emotional honesty, and people would talk about poetry and the ballet without any of our sort of class hang-ups and embarrassments, and there was a lot about that I really loved, yeah. But I was never under any illusions as to what was happening in the country. I mean, you know, we've had...
And I mean, obviously when you were there, you were beginning to see things brewing up and the build-up of troops. I mean, that's detailed in the book. And this sort of realisation that you would probably have to leave Russia.
Yeah. Yes, and that was very surreal because when you're surrounded by people who, you know, you'd say, well, I think I'll probably have to leave, and they'd say, why? You know, this is all nonsense, you're just watching too much CNN. And I mean, do you remember, like, that time was so mad because I don't know what it was like here, but, you know, we were all reading and watching Western TV, and we could see that there was 100,000 troops on the border. And in retrospect, like, what the hell did we think they were doing with them? You know, but there was so much kind of, well, of course, you wouldn't actually try and invade, like, actually try and take Kiev. Not because I think Putin's very nice, but because I thought he wasn't stupid. But being in Russia at that time was really surreal, yeah. And then obviously I was in touch with friends in Kharkiv especially, which is so close to the border, and saying, you know, how are you doing? Like, and they're like, we're just trying, we're just keeping going. So it was all very surreal. And then when it actually happened, I was in Siberia, which was not ideal. So I was in Gorno-Altaysk, right in the heart of the continent, really, near the border with China. And we'd gone on this programme trip, which I didn't think was a particularly good idea. On the 24th of February, and got off the plane at sort of 9 a.m. there, so that was an insane moment of turning on your phone, surrounded by all these mountains and snow, and the phone's just like friends in Kharkiv saying they're bombing us from airplanes, you know, and I said, like, we need to get back on that plane, like, leave this country, and it took days, actually.
Did you find, I mean, I found Ukrainians I've spoken to about that time, that period, they're literally split down the middle. Those that thought, yeah, this is coming, you know, they're definitely going to invade, and others that said, as you mentioned a moment ago, no, he wouldn't be that stupid. Putin wouldn't be that crazy. Do you think that there was that kind of split, really, in terms of their understanding of how events would unfold?
I think so, definitely among Ukrainians. Like, a lot of people, you know, we thought maybe it would just be a bit more into Donbass, but the sort of columns of tanks coming straight from Belarus, no, yeah, there were a few people who were very far-sighted and could see that. But I think, I mean, if we look back at that time, it was really interesting to me because I really fell maybe for that thing that was maybe a bit more prevalent on the left, which was like, oh, Britain and America's sort of stirring things up. You know, they're gunning for war because they were making those issuing those warnings. Do you remember? It was unprecedented. They were saying, we know what you're going to do, in the hope of tripping him up. And yeah, I fell for that, thinking...
Well, that's a good point, because that's something that I even hear, not just, you know, hearing this in Ukraine, but as the war was unfolding, listening to many people, and many of my own friends actually, that I thought would have known better, falling immediately for the lines. Now, you know, I'm sure people will have differing views on this here, that, oh, this is happening because Russia is afraid of NATO expansionism, or this is happening because Ukraine's filled to the rim with Nazis and neo-Nazis and fascists and whatever. I mean, that was the way it was playing out, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was shameful. It was absolutely shameful. It was good to know. I mean, I've always been on the left, and I still am. And I do not count Stalinists as being on the left, and that's what I would call them now. And it's good to know who they are. Do you know that stuff? I mean, I never agreed with the idea that. I mean, if countries wanted to join NATO because they're scared of Russia, that was very much their right to do so. And yeah, that kind of propaganda, it was incredible to hear that from people that I'd known for so long.
When we come back to that, when we get round, I want to continue talking about the book specifically before we get embroiled in the sort of the geopolitics, which I'm sure people have got a few questions about. So just moving on in the sort of narrative of the journey. So you left Russia and went to Romania, yeah?
Yeah, well, I went. They had organised a flight for us, and they said, "Well, where do you want to go?" Well, we'll fly to one place, and I was like, "Well, I'm not going home." Do you know, I would have been. I would have been gutted. I was really struggling at the time. I was getting all these messages because obviously it was like this biggest news story in the world, and I was kind of in the middle of it. So it was all these people saying, "Oh my God, are you all right?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's fine. I just had to pack quickly, you know." And I didn't say goodbye to my Russian boyfriend. I mean, big deal, and I had to leave my guitar. And they were saying, God, but you know, you've wanted this for so long, and this is so sad. And I felt like really I didn't know what to do with all this sympathy, because compared to Ukrainians, like what was I suffering? But yeah, if I'd had to go home, I would have been quite depressed. So I thought, where should I go? I went to Vienna and kind of recouped for a couple of days and thought, and really I was just looking at a map on the floor with all my stuff spread out and the camera and stuff and saying, well, where's good to go? And it was the former nurse in Fair Isle, Elena, who... And she's got all this Romanian info because she lives there. And she was involved in all those networks that had sprung up like overnight. It was incredible, like all over Europe, people helping people get around and get supplies to the army. And she said, why don't you go down to Isacia? And I had no idea where Isacia was. You know, I had no idea about Romania, really. So off I went and got picked up by some strangers and drove in the car for hours and got to this wee port down on the Danube and thought... Okay, yep.
But I remember, you know, some of the brief communication that we had at that time, and you were clearly, you were poised, you were preparing yourself to go into Ukraine, but there were all kinds of, obviously, logistical, bureaucratic, financial, and whatever hurdles that confronts a freelancer in that situation, yeah?
Yeah, so I didn't want to rush in and get in the way, you know, and put other people at risk. I didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to have some training and I wanted to have, you know, the right equipment. And you need accreditation to go and report, which for that you need a commissioning editor to write to the army and say this is who you are. So there were so many obstacles. And yeah, I had no money at all, obviously. And I ended up staying, it's just the kindness of other people. So I could stay in Isacia for quite a while, for a few weeks, because these volunteers said, oh, do you need somewhere to stay? We've got a boat repair workshop and there's a bed up in the top of it and you can just eat in the canteen with all the workers. And that's what I did for like 3 weeks. And that gave me the time to, well, I could report from the port every day, obviously, and started getting commissions like from LRB and stuff like that. And the Sunday Post, which was really important. But yeah, I mean, I think looking back, I was always going to go to Ukraine. I mean, I speak the language, one of the languages. I know a lot about the background. I've got a lot of friends there, and I wasn't going to sit on the border forever. But I really didn't want to rush into it. And there's a bit I describe in the book, actually, about... like I had a dream when I was about to go to Ukraine, and it was, you know, a nightmare about being bombed. And I woke up and I was sweating, and I remember thinking to myself, good, you should be scared, because this is nuts, right? This is really like a crazy decision. And a lot of people told me that I shouldn't do it. A lot of people said, you know, you're being selfish and reckless and you should just come home because you don't have enough experience. And it was a bit of a battle with some editors who said, oh, she's not experienced enough. And you're like, how do you get the experience without doing it first? I don't know. So, yeah, I did give it a lot of thought.
But, I mean, in a way, that I think that's proven to be one of the great strengths of the book, because, you know, it's not written in the way that a sort of conventional memoir would be written by an old grizzled hack or something like that, you know, who spent a lot of time sort of, you know, on the front lines of news situations like that. It's a book about people. It's a book about encounters. It's in many ways, a gentle and lyrical book. That's what I think really separates it from a lot of books that are out there with regards to the stuff that's been written on Ukraine. I mean, were you even conscious of that at that stage? I mean, was the inklings there? A book might come from it at that stage?
No, I wasn't really thinking beyond, you know, each day, I think, at that point. But I mean, I do keep a diary. Or I did, and so I'd have everything kind of, because I was very aware that like this was an extraordinary time in history, and I was getting to be right in the middle of it, and I felt very lucky. So I wanted to record everything that I could, and that was really helpful when I came to write the book. But no, I wasn't really. Obviously, in later trips, then I was thinking about the book. Yeah, but in that first one, it was just kind of, where am I going today, or tomorrow, or right now, really.
Well, maybe it would be a good time to, I know, a couple of readings, just short readings actually, to give a flavour of the mood of that time and the quality of the lyricism of the book itself. Yeah,
so the book's called Night Train to Odessa, and it's slightly... I did get a night train to Odessa, but later on from Kharkiv. And when I first went into Odessa, it was with some volunteers who were taking supplies to the military hospital, which was incredibly useful because it meant we could like zoom through all the checkpoints, as I will explain. But yeah, so the journey would start off... We did this a few times before I actually went to Odessa and stayed in Ukraine, and it's crossing the Danube, which is precisely as romantic and beautiful as it sounds. The barge moved slowly towards the black sliver of land on the other side of the Danube. All around us, the deep ink blue of the fading night became a soft sunrise gold as it met the land, almost perfectly reflected in the river's still waters. I shivered, leaning on the low metal railing and watching Ukraine come into view. Fireflies darted about, their strange halting dashes leaving an imprint on my tired eyes when I rubbed them. Swallows and swifts greeted the boat as we approached the shore. To the starboard side, a small fishing boat slipped past, prow high as the outboard motor churned the water, and the wake it made swirled the vivid hues of the sky, like paints mixing. 2 Red Cross workers were watching the shore too, smoking roll-ups, and we talked for a minute about the unseasonable cold that we'd not prepared for. They were in shorts, and I had on a flimsy child's raincoat. About the beauty of the Delta region and where they were heading. These young men from Greece had never been to Ukraine. They'd barely given it a thought before the war, and the apprehension was written all over their faces. The huge lorries which crammed the deck, gleaming new and emblazoned with logos of humanitarian organisations, roared one by one into life, the cacophony breaking the near peace of this Danube sunrise hour. I found our little red van and hopped in, blowing on my frozen hands. Valery greeted me, ticking me off for getting so cold. He was a retired doctor who'd been working with the volunteers to get medical supplies for this run. We talked in Russian, but like many people in this border region, he could speak Romanian and Ukrainian too. In the long Orlivka queue, I sat in the chilly cab while Valery disappeared into the port buildings with our paperwork, and by mid-morning we were allowed through. Despite having set off 5 hours earlier, we'd barely travelled 20 miles and had a long way to go through innumerable checkpoints and briefly Moldova. It could have taken a day or more, but we had a golden ticket. Anya, our military escort, who met us an hour into the journey, turning up at a roadside coffee shop in an ancient little car. Because Valery's supplies were going to Odessa's military hospital, Anya would escort us all the way, and this was a godsend. She was a young woman of stony determination and appalling driving style. She jumped into the van, stuck on some patriotic tunes, and put her foot down. It remained there. As we approached the queues of cars waiting at a checkpoint, she would drive, skidding, down the dusty edge of the road, or simply head straight into oncoming traffic, honking the horn. I thought this was fantastic, having grown up with island driving, but poor Valery, wedged in alongside me in the van's small cab, was gripping the seat and pleading with Anya to slow down. "This woman," he kept exclaiming, "she's going to get us killed. Oi, what a girl." And she laughed, thrusting her military credentials out of the window to flash at the outraged drivers and bewildered young soldiers. She was a force of nature nobody would stop, and we reached Odessa by lunchtime, somehow still in one piece.
Thank you. I did say it was lyrical. Those early days of the war, Jen, as we both know, I mean, there was a lot of fear around, but there was an incredible sense of resourcefulness, a sense of solidarity that I have to say, after 40 years of covering conflict, I've rarely encountered anywhere in the world that I encountered when I first went into Ukraine at that time. Were you aware of that as well? Did you? It was so obvious, wasn't it?
It was just extraordinary. It was so extraordinary. I remember when I was still in Moscow, and a bureau chief of a big agency were talking about the possibility of war, and she said, "Oh, you don't go to Ukraine because that's going to be a nasty war. That's going to be hell. Don't go there." And you know, it was one of the many voices I had in my head as I was trying to make this decision. And when I got there, and particularly that day in Odessa, I dreamed of going to Odessa all my life. Like, I used to walk around it on Google Street View when I was stuck in Shetland. and to be in this city with these people, right? Outside the military hospital, all the volunteers are like joking and laughing around with each other, and the sense of camaraderie, of common purpose. And then people would talk about, you know, the news from Mariupol, and somebody would start crying and somebody would laugh again. And like, it was so, all the emotions were so high, and this sense of everybody coming together, you can't, I mean, I've never seen anything like that in my life. It was, and I just, again, felt so lucky to be in the middle of it, you know, and because I wasn't, I mean, the benefit of being a freelancer, you're not a staff correspondent, you're not being sent from one place to the other. So I would just say, well, this is interesting. I think I'll just hang out here for a while and with these people. And in Kharkiv as well. I mean, many people had left Kharkiv when I got there, but my friends were still there because they're all volunteers helping the army. Some had joined the army, and they were just alive, you know. It just felt like
I think that you hit a couple of very important points there. One is the fact that being a freelancer and there are obvious downsides again, which we'll touch on later, but that capacity, that ability to move around freely, get beneath the skin of the place, you know, not be constantly on deadline in quite the same way that perhaps a staffer is invaluable, particularly for that, and the kinds of long form writing that you actually really sort of thrive at, I think. But that optimism, as the book progresses, you know, and some of the encounters that you have, I mean, I'm not suggesting the optimism declines in the book, because that resilience is there throughout this book. But that journey is into the war. You began to see a much harsher face of it appearing, of course, yeah? Yeah, of course. I mean, is there a moment where you think, I really am in a war here now? I mean, this is the real deal, you know. This is not some sort of glorified or romanticised notion of visiting or reporting on a conflict. Yeah, well, I mean, it was in Odessa when there had been this sort of 2 weeks of relative calm, and I was getting lots and lots of messages from people at home and sort of military people and you saying, there's going to be, you need to get out of Odessa. Remember, there was this big fear that the troops from Transnistria would come down, and then they'd break through at Mykolaiv and they'd come by the sea, and it would be sort of encircled, and then you'd be trapped in Odessa, which, you know, didn't sound great, obviously. But it was when that strike happened on Easter Sunday or the Saturday of that weekend, and I went to report on it, and that was, I mean, it was hellish, of course. There's, you know, a rocket going straight through a block of flats and killed a little girl and her mum and the granny. They were all hiding in the bathroom. But it was that night, actually, that I got really freaked out, because I was sleeping in this kind of bedsit Airbnb thing in this man, it was so beautiful, this courtyard with like rats and cats and cherry blossom and laundry hanging out. I just loved it, you know. Odessa's like, you know, there's a lot of faded grandeur, and I remember like the air raid sirens going on and on and on all night, and wondering what they were going to do. And because I was quite close to the cathedral, then the bells would join in, which was kind of beautiful and eerie. And I had a Odessan boyfriend who I put in the book, because why not? And he had, you know, when someone else is there, you don't get scared. But he'd gone off to go and collect people from the front line or something, and you just lie awake imagining what a blast would do when you've got French doors, and how you know, what happens to a body in that thing. But then, you know, it was Easter morning, and I got up and made coffee and went to church, and people get on with things. You just get on with things, yeah. I mean, the war itself also, I mean, there's a sequence where you're described, I think it's in November 22, when you were back in Kiev, and you were staying in a hostel, Andrivsky Descent, and there was all kinds of oddballs, and I mean, one of the things I should stress here is that war does attract some very freaky people, not just the people inside the country, but from outside. And I think this hostel in particular had quite a number of Americans and others there. It did indeed, the creepy boys. Yeah, and just people who were like living their own drama. Do you know, like they'd turn up and be like, yeah, I was in NASA. Like, oh, I. Yeah. Or and this boy following me around saying he was in the CIA. Yeah, weird. And you're like, what are you doing here?
And they'd come, I mean, there's, especially in Lviv, you get this a lot because they can say, oh, I'm in a war zone. I mean, Lviv is relatively safe, and just post constantly on Facebook, and you see all these people saying, oh, stay safe, well done, you're so brave. And you're like, but what are you doing? Are you just picking up girls and getting drunk? And yeah, they are. Yeah, I thought I'd include that as a kind of, it's a wee vignette that just points at something.
When I came across it, and when I first read the book, I remember actually myself being on the border between Poland when I was first crossing on my way to Lviv, you know, and teams of American ex-servicemen, you know, kitted out in, you know, gear, you know, coming in to fight ostensibly, you know, weird sort of pseudo-mercenaries or real mercenaries, a lot of cranks and nutcases as well. You know? Yeah,
a lot of cranks but I mean a lot of really, really good people as well. Yeah. I mean, so many Czechs and Georgians, there's so many just volunteering to fight. And that was the funny thing about that hostel, is that I think because it was cheap and it was quite central, so a lot of them would come there and you'd see all the, you know, the creepy boys, the wannabe mercenaries, and then like real mercenaries would come in, you know, with their keffiyeh and their big gun, and you'd see these boys be like, ooh, ooh, you know.
The glamour of it.
And I just sort of, I mean, sometimes you have to sit back and just observe and laugh at things around you, because it's absurd, you know.
I want to touch again on the idea of freelancing here. I know you feel very, very passionate about, you know, for want of a better expression, the plight of freelancers. And as someone myself who's spent a lot of time freelancing over the years, I completely empathise with this, you know. I don't think, just to give some idea for the audience here, for the folk here, you know, what it's like to kind of, as a friend of mine once described it, trapezing without a safety net, basically. I mean, you're going into a really dangerous situation, you have no backup, you have no big command structure, you have no editors leaning over your shoulder with protection, there's no high-risk officers to get you out of a nasty situation. How acutely aware were you? I mean, it does come across in the book quite strongly.
My awareness of that, or the fact...
Your awareness of...
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think because I was with my friends a lot, you know, my Ukrainian friends, and so it didn't feel like I was sort of on my own. And I had really good training. I mean, I'd saved up, well, I didn't save up. I got a grant from the Rody Peck Trust, which is the only way to pay for the £1,500 hostile environment training.
That seems to be a recurring figure in your life.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So I got a grant that covered half of that, and just the rest was all credit cards. And it was great. It was like the 3-day course where they chuck you out of cars when they're shooting at you with paintballs, and there's things on fire, and you have to put on tourniquets. And I loved it. It was great. And they gave you really useful advice. And one of it was... you know, you can have all the plans and the insurance and stuff set up, but really, if you are doing frontline work, then the only thing that really matters is the brigade any good? Do they have a good evacuation plan? Do they have good tourniquets? Because some of them are crap. And do they, you know, will they get you out? Because no one's coming to get you. Like, no one is coming to get you. But no, I was very aware, because we can't actually really get insurance now, freelancers, and it's a really big problem. The insurance that we did have that was discounted, they put caveat in saying that it wouldn't be valid in like Kharkiv, Donbass, you know, all the places that you would go. And that's the bigger worry, I suppose, is that if you are permanently unwell or hurt or disabled for the rest of your life, you're not getting any big payout. And that's the kind of, you know, you're living in the DWP for the rest of your life. And that's, yeah. So I would worry in an appropriate amount and then say, well, let's put this on the list of things that I can't actually affect that much. And I'd say with editors, like, it's not... it's a really fine line, because they don't have the budget. The people who are commissioning me genuinely don't have the budget to pay for all that kind of very expensive insurance and stuff. And they would do what they could. And also, they didn't want to put me in danger. So it was never them encouraging me. It was always me saying, I'm going to go here. It won't be that bad. And they go, oh, God. You know? But what happens, like, for instance, with the World Service, I was doing a bit of, like, packages for them, and that was great. But then someone in management freaked out, and there became this edict of, like, no freelancers from Ukraine. And that's, you know, that's just pushing us into worse, poorer paid work. You know, so it's kind of arse covering. And
there was also, it's the case, just to enlighten folk again, I mean, within the industry, and just to take an example with the BBC, there were like different kind of, almost like competing kind of editorial responses. Some were quite happy for journalists and freelancers to go into certain areas. Others were reading the riot acts, you know, through high-risk teams and saying, no, you can't do that because, you know, we're liable in that sense. And certainly you can't operate in these areas without this very expensive hostile environment training you're talking about. You know?
I mean, people do. I just don't think that you should. you know, I had friends who just went straight into Ukraine without any training, without any protection, and I told them I thought that was stupid, you know, when we had a falling out. But yeah, I think I found some, you know, maybe I was on the middle ground of safety. I mean, I got a flak jacket because, I mean, there was none in Europe. Do you remember? Like, everything was sold out, prices were through the roof, you couldn't get anything. And it was before the RSF.
It's not like going to tie rack, you know?
And it's because this volunteer, Marianne and like Stuart and so on, they could just find stuff, you know. And I think he found it in like, came from Kabul, and like a friend had sent it. And it was really sad because he sent it through to ODESA, and I was like, oh, thank God, I've got a flak jacket, I can go to Mykolaiv. And I put it on, and it was like down to here because they're all made for giant men, you know. And that was a recurring problem, actually, was that everything's too big. Everything's too big for me.
Let's have another reading from the book.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, talking of going to... So this is towards the end when I had all this training and I had my flak jacket, because you could borrow them, you can get them on loan now, which is a really great initiative. And I'd persuaded an editor that I could go to a village. I mean, this is really sad because this is pretty much occupied now, Chasiv Yar. Watching the places on the map get swallowed up is I don't even know how to describe it at the moment. Anyway, I'll do a brief story from Siversk. What was supposed to happen was this. I would jump in a minibus with some volunteers who, every day except Sundays, drove to heavily shelled places and took civilians out to safety. There were many such volunteer groups all across Ukraine, some made up of foreigners. Pete Reed, a former US Marine, had been killed a month earlier, getting people out of Bakhmut, and he was not the first. This evacuation run was going to Chasiv Yar, a small town 8 miles from Bakhmut, but not nearly as dangerous. Another journalist had given me the number of Vlad, who was in charge, and I'd asked if he would let me tag along. He'd called back late last night. Be at the petrol station outside Slavyansk at 8 a.m. I arrived 20 minutes early, because I hate rushing and wanted to get a coffee, but the parking lot was already full of jeeps, people in flak jackets with press across them milling around, clearly about to go somewhere. I parked the little car, threw on my own vest and helmet, and ran up to them. Are you going on the evacuation run? I asked. Yes, yes, the harassed Ukrainian driver said in English. It's leaving now. Well, can I jump in with you? And he looked nonplussed. I guess so, yeah. I squeezed in the back of the jeep alongside other foreign reporters. The convoy moved off. I had a feeling that something was not quite right. 20 minutes went by. The roads got worse, potholed and muddy, as we began to climb a long hill, and I looked at the map on my phone, perplexed. I didn't want to annoy them, given the driver was less than thrilled about having me there. I cleared my throat. This is a funny way to get to Chasiv Yar. It was, in fact, the opposite direction. There was a silence in the car, and then a French reporter said slowly, "We're not going to Chasiv Yar." The driver turned to look at me. Who are you supposed to be with? I gave the name of Vlad and his group. You're in the wrong convoy, he said. Oh, I said, shit. Where are you going? Siversk, came the blunt reply. And there was another long silence. It was obviously too late to turn back, and they couldn't really chuck me out, though they looked like they wanted to. I apologised profusely and tried to ignore the hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach, which was my body shouting, "This is very bad." Siversk was much further away, up near the border of Luhansk Oblast. It was in the middle of what looked on the map like a pocket surrounded by the red of Russian-held territory. I'd persuaded an editor to take a story from Chasiv Yar on the basis that it was coloured green on the insurance company's risk map, indicating my policy was still valid there. Siversk was very firmly in the red zone, although to be fair, the map was pretty arbitrary and shells were hitting both towns regularly. The press officer will need to speak to you when we get to Siversk, the driver said tersely. He's going to be pissed off. I agreed that this seemed likely and quite understandable, and then kept quiet for a while as the jeep thudded and lurched through mud-filled craters, and we crawled higher into the chalk hills. I'll give you a little bit about Siversk as well. It's still actually not occupied, but I suspect that won't last for very long. The hospital was still open. It was a normal provincial hospital with a few wards, a long building with trees all around it. Some craters we passed in the grounds looked fresh. The earth was black where it had been blown up. At the main door, on a bench in the sun, a little row of old ladies sat wrapped up in shawls and coats. They didn't seem to be patients, but I was just introducing myself when it came, that menacing whistle, high-pitched and descending, and the first bang. Prilyot, a man's voice shouted. It means roughly arrival by air, incoming. The little old ladies had risen from their perch and were shuffling inside. Painfully slowly, it seemed to me, and time had started to stretch weirdly. I am not going to push the babushkas out of the way, I thought. Once in, we were ushered underground. There was nothing crumbling about this basement. It was a proper sturdy shelter, and I was glad of it. Down the stairs into the dark, low-ceilinged corridor, I suddenly sensed thick smoke and felt a little stab of panic. I hate being underground. All the scenarios of being trapped here without air raced through my mind. But then I noticed it was pleasant smoke. It was wood smoke, rich with fuzzy childhood nostalgia. We passed a little room and I saw the big old boiler, the janitor adding wood to the furnace. No wonder all these elderly people were sheltering here. It was safe and warm, and there had been no mains gas in Seversk since the invasion began. Firewood meant survival. Down a long corridor packed with supplies, it was clear the remaining staff slept here sometimes, from the toiletries and basins of water next to camping beds. I talked to a woman sitting on one of the beds, a nurse. She didn't want to be quoted. She apologised, but said they'd had rather a lot of foreign journalists recently. I could well imagine. At the end of the corridor, next to a pile of coats, a tiny old woman was waiting out the strike. I took her picture, and she told me not to, so I apologised and put the camera away. The other foreign journalist, though, began filming her, his camera hovering inches from her face. I think she's had enough of journalists, I said, to no avail. And I felt a bit sick with the whole thing, us descending like vultures on this picked-over place, recording their misery and then leaving.
You said that you kept a diary. At what point did the kind of book come together in your head? I mean, at what point do you say, right, I've got to sit down and write a book here rather than just keeping a diary going?
I sat down to write the book in autumn 23, and that's because I got a grant from Creative Scotland from the Open Fund, which then just closed down. And it was that enabled me to sit and just immerse myself in it all. Because I'm not the kind of person that could do, I don't know, people say, oh, I wrote my book in little bits in between this and in between dinner and getting the kids. No, I needed to focus entirely on that and not do other work. And it took me a while to sit down and do that and get all the photos and the videos and all the recordings and transcriptions, because I wanted to kind of like live it all again, you know? And it was really, I mean, I loved it. It was great. But, I mean, it was exhausting. Like,
so
I was writing
in a comparatively short space of time?
7 weeks. Yeah.
Seven weeks.
Yeah. So I just planned out like how many words is that per day if you need 80,000 words, and then that would be my target for each day. And my friend Christopher Silver proofread everything, and he's a genius, and he's the reason the book is readable, frankly. So I had that kind of constant encouragement of like, he's like, this is really good, this is really... And because he knows me as well, he could be like, I don't think you want to say, I think you've gone a bit overly there, and I'll be like, yeah, I know that, okay. But yeah, it was a really intense process, and I really enjoyed it, because it was... I mean, to write like beautifully, as beautifully as you can, about people and places that you deeply love, like that's a joy. That's such a joy.
But I'm always interested, I think as many people are, it always reminds me of the famous magazine, the Paris Review. They had a compilation of, it was a series called Writers at Work, and they were just like cameo insights into the way, the methods, if you like, that writers adopt. Some people have to read a piece from the Bible, some people like to write standing up, others need to sharpen 12 pencils or wash the dishes first or something. It was peculiar insight into the kind of creative process. I mean, do you have a structure like that? Is there any kind of little ritualistic thing you do? I mean, do you say, right, by the end of the day I want X number of 1,000 words written and that's it? Yeah, very much like I need the deadline, I need the pressure. You know, without that it's just nothing happens, nothing comes. And I write very early in the morning, because after about 4 o'clock I'm useless to the world, you know, there's no good thoughts are coming from this head out in the evening. So, and I like early in the morning. I mean, I was renting a house up in Vaughan in the north of Shetland, and I really didn't see anybody for like all of that. I mean, I didn't go out, I just did this, to the point where, you know, when you haven't talked much and then you kind of forget how to, and you talk to people and they, yep. So yeah, it was quite intense, but I think that suits me, that's how I like it. Before we get on to the Q&A, I want to just open that up by talking a little bit about the politics and the current situation. I think we all agree that, and we were talking about this before we came on stage here, this is a pretty precarious, there's been many precarious moments over the last 1,000 days or 3 years or more of the war, but we are at a very precarious moment. Would you agree with that? It's
not good. Yeah, it's not good. It's as I said, like watching you know, you can obsess over it, and it's very hard to stop reading the news and to stop following it. But watching the maps, you know, the deep state map, and you can see the Russian advance. These places, you know, like Konstantinovka, Kurakova, these are places I know people there. They're beautiful places. Like, one of the things I wanted to get across in the book is how beautiful Donbass is. You know, it's not the stereotype of like grey, grim, post-Soviet. I mean, it's an extraordinary landscape with extraordinary people, and it really feels, I feel it a lot, you know, I really do, watching this happen. And it just didn't have to. You know, if they'd just helped them properly in the beginning, we wouldn't be in this position. And now with Trump coming in, everything's so unknown. And all my friends are scared, you know, they're really scared.
If you had to hazard a guess, where do you think it is going? I mean, I know that's an incredibly open-ended question, and I'm constantly asked it also and fail to answer it. But
I think like whoever has Kursk by Christmas, I think we'll see who's got the upper hand, because the Ukrainians holding on to that territory in Kursk is their leverage. There are going to be negotiations. As you were saying, hopefully Europe's included in that, and it's not just Trump and Putin carving up the map, which, I mean, what is this, the 1930s, you know? There will be negotiations, of course, and Ukraine needs to have leverage, because at the moment, the Russian demands, they're still what they were in June this year, are to have all 4 oblasts. Now, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk and Donetsk, they never got Zaporizhia city, so they're demanding that they get a whole city of 400,000 people that they've never occupied. And Kherson is back in Ukrainian hands, though they're, you know, making life hell there. No one's going to agree to that. That's insane, obviously. So and that's the problem for Ukrainians. If they thought Putin was going to negotiate with any and keep his word, but they don't, because he never did. So it's really, really difficult. And hearing people say, do you know, it was after that counter-offensive last year, which was so hyped up, and they kept saying we don't have enough ammunition, and the Russians are really well dug in, and it was so hyped up, and then they failed, and then everyone here started to go, oh well, hasn't it been going on a little bit too long? And I just thought that was morally, like, revolting, to make them fight with their hands tied behind their backs and not enough support, and then start saying, oh, isn't it time they maybe gave up? And I think anyone who recommends that they give up or concede territory should very fully well understand what that means in terms of occupation. It means mass graves and executions and torture chambers. That's what you're saying, that you should send over hundreds of thousands of people into that. I mean, is that really people's position? I find that extraordinary. As
we were talking before we came on stage, we were talking about, I was telling Jen there was a quote from the Wall Street Journal a few days ago, which they were citing a number of sources within the Trump transition team who were saying that what they're looking for ideally is a kind of demilitarised zone, an 800-mile demilitarised zone, which would need to be policed. This is if a peace deal and a ceasefire came about, of course, and we're a long way off that. But should that happen, we'd have a DMZ, and it would be policed, this Trump source was saying, not by American boots, he hastened to add, not even by American-funded body like the United Nations. And I'm quoting him here, and he said, let the Poles, the Brits, the French and the Germans police it. The barrels of guns should be their guns that are pointing in any direction towards the Russians, which I found quite an alarming prospect. But at the same time, I think we both agree that Europe needs to have a seat at the table here, otherwise Trump and Putin are going to carve this up between them.
I'm hoping this is the big kick up the arse for Europe, right? I mean, not just like take defence spending seriously and have a plan, my God, but also like listen to the Eastern European countries who have always been warning about this massive threat. I mean, Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, they know what Russia is. We just haven't been listening to them for a very long time. It's so frustrating to watch this play out, really.
I'd like to start taking a few questions, if we may. We'll wait for the microphone to come to you. That would be great. Any questions from our audience? Gentleman here to begin with.
Thanks very much, first of all, for coming to enlighten us about the reality of the situation. It's interesting to me, know Ukraine well. I don't know it at all, but I do know Romania, because I went out about 30 years ago and bought a £150 banger and drove over as a charity worker. And it was interesting that there was immense poverty then. I'm not sure, I don't think it's as bad as it was then, but it was seriously bad. You know, you get somebody who owned only one cow and he had a rope round it and he was watching it graze and keeping an eye on it. And there was all sorts of people at the side of the road with, you know, wrapped in paper seeds that they were selling to passers-by. And I just wondered if Ukraine was very similar, because the basic people I found were fantastic and kind, and they would share whatever they had with you. Yeah. And I got the impression probably Ukraine was very similar.
Yeah, it's a great culture of hospitality and generosity. I mean, to the point of absurdity, people just give you things all the time. I mean, I was constantly I just found so much kindness, you know, wherever I went. Particularly from old ladies who were constantly worried about me and saying, "Oh, isn't your flak jacket too heavy, dear? You know, isn't your granny worried about you?" No, I mean Romania. I was so lucky to be in Romania. That part of the country, it is still really poor, yeah, and that part actually is the poorest. And what they were doing for Ukrainians was extraordinary. Extraordinary. They were going so out of their way. And actually, for a lot of Ukrainians coming across the Danube, then, I mean, a lot of them are poor and they'd never left Ukraine, and they didn't know what they were going to be met with, you know, because it's not exactly the easiest history in that region between the two countries, right? And it was then that they would burst into tears when there's all these Romanians giving them like sandwiches and SIM cards and cups of tea, and that was extraordinary to see. And I remember going to see there were some Odessan women that I met, and they were put up in digs sort of about an hour's drive away in the hills. In this, you know, just in a wee village with like a family that had some hens and a cow. And I remember talking to the women, the mother, and I said, why are you putting up all these Ukrainians, you know? And she just turned to me and she said, because we could be next. Yeah. And she was crying.
The lady here, please.
Thank you for your talk, and I can see that you really have deep knowledge of the region. And I wanted to ask, based on your experience in following the geopolitical situation, do you feel now that Trump and Putin have come into power that there is a stronger possibility of Russia invading the Baltic states and Poland?
I don't know, because I don't know what Trump's going to do, and I don't think anybody does. I don't know what he believes in. I don't know what his ideology is. It seems to be just whatever he fancies at the time. So it's massively difficult to actually even guess about what's going to happen.
But what about Putin?
What about Putin? What about Putin? I think a lot of time is spent trying to suss out his motives and psychology. But really, you just need to read the essay that he wrote during lockdown about Ukraine. It's all complete fabricated nonsense, but it's outlining why he does not believe that nation exists. It's just little Russia, you know. That's the driving force. It's not even about territory. They don't want Donbass. Nobody wants Donbass. You know, it's like it's got its problems, and it's about it's partly about not. They couldn't bear that Ukraine was going its own way, and that it was going its own way in like really interesting developments, more pro-Europe in the 2012, 2013 revolution. It's ideological. It's trying to squash them down, as they've been doing. I mean, people should really hopefully understand that this isn't come out of nowhere. There's hundreds of years of, you know, the Moscow rulers banning Ukrainian language, killing Ukrainians, the Holodomor, the famine. Yeah, there's a long history to this, and I think that informs what he's going to do next, which is keep going, if he can.
I mean, I think the only predictable thing, if I may, that is Trump's unpredictability. I actually, from a personal perspective, I believe that possibly if anyone can bring people round the table, oddly enough, I think it's Donald Trump. You know, if a peace deal is coming, I think, as I was saying to Jen earlier, I see it like a big sausage machine with all these ingredients being put in, ceding territory, security guarantees, goodness knows what, then we'll turn the handle and what shape or form it comes out the other end. The big question, I think, and one that maybe Jen would like to comment on is, you know, I think President Zelensky here is kind of damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't. You know, there are a lot of people who are looking, obviously, for an end to the war. If he helps bring that around, at what price, at what cost and in what terms, if he cedes territory, given all the blood and sacrifice. So I think it's probably politically difficult for Zelensky in the future, whatever happens.
Massively. I mean, he's still got extraordinarily high approval ratings, given, you know, after years of war and everything. You wouldn't expect him to. And I think you have to remember, like, what he did by staying in Kiev, and that video they did. Do you remember saying, like, the president's here, chief of staff is here, smiling, reassuring? It gave people such strength and courage to stay in Kiev and fight it out. But yeah, I mean, I don't envy him that position at all. It's, I mean, when Trump won the election and Zelensky had to do that sort of painful, you know, like commenting and say, oh, well, you know, we're looking forward to meeting with him, and sort of awful, like, photo shoot. Yeah, but they have to. They have to.
It's a realpolitik.
Just a couple of nights ago, I saw on the American public broadcast was a programme about the Welsh journalist who went in the 1930s.
Yeah, Gareth Jones.
Yeah.
And basically Stalin starved the Ukrainians into submission.
Yes.
Why won't Putin do the same? He's got the rockets now, and he's starting to use new ones. And he's also, I think, got an eye on Moldova.
Yes, he does, yeah.
So I find a sort of disconnect here about the negotiations, just the Donbass. I think he wants the lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, of course, but he can't. He's realised that he can't actually get the lot. I mean, they'll fight till. I mean, Ukrainians won't give up because it's existential. They can't give up, so they will fight to the last man, and you can't. Yeah, I mean, they've tried to take Kharkiv like twice now, and they should learn the lessons of World War II and the terrain and so on. Yeah, no, they talk. It's really interesting to hear what they say about Moldova on Russian TV, what Russian politicians say, because it's like, oh, the Moldovan government is oppressing the Russian speakers, and you're like, oh, really? Are they? We're getting this again. We're going to go in and protect them. It's the same rhetoric, exactly the same. Yeah, and I mean, as for the Holodomor, it was a genocide, and one of the complications of Eastern Ukraine, and it's really, really grim, and you could say the same about Crimea, is that if everybody starves and then the government shifts lots and lots of ethnic Russians into their homes, you know, bodies are barely cold, 50, 60 years down the line, you're going to have some very complicated and very painful, messy identity, loyalty issues, and a lot of past that nobody wants to speak about because it's really grim. And with Crimea now, if they've deported most of the people or killed lots of people, imprisoned lots of people, Ukrainians have left or gone, and most people are pro-Russian there. We don't know that because we can't get proper polls. But, like, that's a really difficult situation. You can say Crimea is Ukrainian, and I agree, but I'm not sure that's coming back, you know.
Hello, thank you. Very interesting. Putin is clearly on record as wanting to re-establish the Russian Empire, but I believe he probably wants to extend its borders even more. I'm just wondering whether he's overstepped the mark by making a really big mistake in Ukraine. I don't actually believe any peace deal will work, and ultimately I am wondering whether he will actually fail in all this. Oddly enough, I don't think Trump is going to have a huge influence in this. I think Trump is going to have his own worries back in America. And lastly, how do you feel about NATO? Personally, I think they've sat on the fence and missed an opportunity to nip this in the bud.
Oh, how do I feel about NATO? Look, I've always been on the left. I've always, been critical of particularly American foreign policy and British. And I think, I was thinking about this the other day, for everyone, when the Iraq War, do you remember those big protests? And I remember, standing up in, third-year modern studies and sort of shaking and being like, we're going to walk out now in Lerwick, And that was such a huge deal. That shaped the whole generation shaped our kind of consciousness so much and our understanding of American foreign policy. But, you can have things that aren't great, but they're better than the alternative. Do you know? I've lived in Russia. I can see that it's fascist. I can see that that's fascism. I can see that, that what's happening in Ukraine is a genocide. I can see all that. And so it's very easy for me to understand and take a side on that, take a position on that. I'm not neutral in this. I report objectively, obviously. If the Ukrainians do something that's bad, I will write about it. But I know which side I'm on. And I mean, what the really interesting thing about
NATO
Trump
has sat on the fence here? Do you think that NATO has, has succumbed to the kind of, you know, Putin's threats and kind of saber rattling?
Yeah, because of Germany. Because of Germany. I mean, like, what the hell is going on in Germany? That's a bigger question. But that kind of, oh, you know, we mustn't upset Putin too much. Oh, the red line. Do you know how many red lines there have been? Like 36. What's happened each time? Nothing. So this kind of pussyfooting around Putin and oh, we shouldn't upset him, that's led to this kind of havering, sitting on the fence, which is why it's such a mess now. And one thing that actually that Trump says about NATO, which I agree with, is that, you know, when he says, oh, the Europeans have kind of been coasting and not paying enough money, he's right. You can't just rely on America for forever. Like, they're pretty far away, you know, it's not their fight. So
the Europeans, I think, do need to step up to the plate when any deal that's been created here.
I just wanted to ask a bit more about about you and the writing, and I suppose how you feel now with the book out and things, of the sort of intensity of the reporting from the region being there, and the sort of immediacy of the day by day of how that kind of comes out, and how it of course responds to specific events and things that are happening. In relation to, you described the process a bit of the book, the writing of the book in Vaux in the house, and how that comes out afterwards. And in a way, it's like maybe two sort of bodies of work, if you like. You know, the reporting, the intensity, and then the reflection in the book, and how the sort of readership of those sort of varies, or what kind of responses you get from that. Sort of interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, I mean, obviously a lot of the reporting I did, I then sort of put into the book, but I would flesh it out and put in more of the kind of details and the context of what was going on, which was really enjoyable actually, to sort of, I mean, 800 words, you know, word count is never enough in a report, or like 2 minutes on the radio. You can never really describe what's going on, and to put in all the kind of how I felt. And that was really difficult, because my instinct as a journalist, your instinct is never to even use the word I. And I'd started to do that, I suppose, because doing like Reporter's Notebook, you know, stuff, I love doing that, because you get that chance to really connect with people, I think. And I get all these lovely messages, folks saying, oh, I was driving along, listening to Radio Scotland, and I had to pull over and just listen to what you're saying, or I was doing the washing up. And now I know that I've made that emotional connection with them. They'll always have that image of like the Bings in Donetsk region, you know, they'll have that kind of image of a place which previously maybe they didn't really think about. So yeah, melding all that stuff together, like, it was maybe a wee bit challenging, but mostly I really enjoyed it. And the feedback has been so lovely. I mean, one of the loveliest things is someone said, oh, I would never read about war, I would never read even like non-fiction, but this was really easy. This was really like, it flows and it's easy to read, and you're kind of like, I'm there with you and then you're there with me. And it meant I had to put like all of my heart and soul and feelings into it, which is terrifying. But, you know, here we are, done it, and it's not killed me.
I think that's the power of great reportage, you know, that getting beneath the surface in that way, rather than it being cold and analytical. This is the antithesis of that. And I think great reportage does that. You know, I've mentioned before, like, comparisons, you know, with the great Martha Gellhorn and people like that. You know, that kind of writing, I think, really gives people an insight into what war is actually like, rather than the day-to-day reporting. We've got time for a couple of quickies.
Thanks very much. Superbly engaging. And actually, following on from Ross, I was going to ask you about where you wrote the actual book, and you said Vaux. And is that not where Kate Adie also came from?
It is.
And was she an inspiration? Did you feel like you were sort of maybe, I don't know, walking in footsteps?
I don't think she was there very long,
you share a passion for a beer, though, doesn't you? Because I know Kate Adie does drink. I've been in her company, and she's not a few.
Well, I wasn't at that time because I was writing the book. Yeah, no, I'd say, it was Martha. It was Martha Gellhorn. I mean, like, the whole, she's so funny and mad. My friend gave me this big, like, massive tome of her letters. It was years ago, and I was reading it on the train, and she's working in like a local newspaper in New Jersey, and she's writing, oh man, I just want to be in Russia, you know, and I'm like, oh my God. This is really familiar. And that kind of like sheer determination, but also the way that she wrote with such humanity. Like she's not judging people. And she's not, I mean, at that time, obviously, she's better known for being married to Hemingway. And the difference in their reporting, partly because he made shit up all the time, but his is so bombastic, right? It's so macho, and hers is so under the surface, and you learn so much more from her stories, I think, than from that kind of macho stuff. You know, who needs to know, like, the millimetre of the gun every time? But I do want to know, like, what that person looked like and what they said, and, yeah.
One last question, please.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you very much for what you've written and what you've done. I'm completely in awe of you. Absolutely amazing, and look forward to reading. What did you choose to do next? The question I had was, did you get any insight into resistance, either from Russian military or Russian peoples, to what's going on?
Yeah. Well, do you remember at the beginning there was a kind of phenomenon we kept seeing online, which was, and it says so much about Russian society and its difference to Ukrainian, so there'd be lots and lots of soldiers and they'd nominate one sort of spokesman and they all line up looking absolutely terrified and they read a statement saying, "Dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, we don't have any food. I'm sure it's just an oversight, but could you, we've actually And the same thing happened when the Ukrainian army made the incursion into Kursk Oblast, is that people who hadn't been evacuated, they were just left behind, and they're all doing exactly the same thing. Dear Mr. Putin, we don't seem to have been evacuated. Please, could you fix it? You would never catch Ukrainians behaving in that way, in that craven kind of, sorry. They're the opposite. Ukrainian society is so, it's very horizontal. It's very, let's just go and do it together. And I remember talking to my friend saying, Ivana, who's in the book quite a lot, and she, her whole life has just been taken over by this stuff, since 2014. And I said to her, do you ever get fed up, having to do all this? And it's, why isn't the state doing it? And she just turned around quick as a flash and she said, well, we are the state. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. I've never had to think about that. Yeah, I've forgotten your original question. I just started rambling about.
I guess it was like the opposite to how those Russian soldiers behaved.
The resistance. I mean, look, it's brutal. It's very sort of Stalin-esque in that they're often, as I understand, they're often not allowed to turn back. They'll be shot. And the tactic of the Russian military is to send waves and waves and waves of barely trained conscripts or whoever into machine gun fire.
Koreans.
And now North Koreans and Yemenis today as well. Mm. And can you imagine being a Ukrainian on a position, and you just have to machine gun all these mow down human beings in wave after wave after wave until they will eventually swap your position. The Ukrainians are at a disadvantage because they won't do that. They won't treat their human beings like that. In terms of resistance in Russian society, I mean, there was some. Most of my friends who are decent have left. They left at the beginning of the war to live in other parts of Europe. It's crushed immediately. I think the thing about Russia is, they did have big protests in 2012, and look what happened. It was crushed. It was crushed. Look what happened to those people in Belarus. Look what the state did to those people. It's horrifying. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that an uprising could change the situation in Russia. I think hope comes from defeat. They have to be militarily defeated, and then there has to be a process of them acknowledging what they've done, really.
Which they haven't done.
No.
Just to wrap up then, I know from experience that, there's a certain kind of locations, a certain conflicts, whatever, which individual journalists become intimately associated and can't leave alone. It becomes their kind of baptism of fire, and obviously Ukraine and the Russian war there is yours, Jen. I mean, what are you doing next? Are you going back there, or do you see yourself continuing in this line of work, or?
Yeah, I want to go back there as soon as I can, hopefully in January, which will be an interesting time, with Trump coming in. I want to go back to Kharkiv and see my friends and give them a big hug, it suits me. It suits me, and I kind of knew that it would. I find normal life much more tricky, to be honest, and all the bureaucracy and paying the rent and doing small talk and everything. Whereas, like, you know, in Donbass, I'm quite happy actually. So yeah, I'd like to go back. I mean, people were asking if you know, when stuff was happening in the Middle East, and they said, "Oh, are you going to go there?" But I mean, I don't speak the language. I haven't studied it, so I wouldn't be able to do the kind of in-depth, you know, like reportage and essays and stuff that I really enjoy. So. Yeah, I can't. I'd like to go to Eastern Europe. I'd like to go to the Balkans and Kosovo and Serbia and like Baltic states and say, like, what's going on here? You know, are we listening to them enough? Because they've got a very different view of what's happening. But yeah, initially, well, paperback's coming out in February, and I might go to America for the first time in my life because the book's out there. But yeah, hopefully back to Kharkiv in January.
Okay. Well, I'm sure the audience will join me in wishing you well, whatever comes next, and certainly if you go back to Ukraine. Obviously, Jen will be signing copies of the book upstairs, which is available for those of you who haven't read it. What a cracking read it really is. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to Jen Stout for today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.